Good afternoon, good morning, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. This is Tom here, going to be talking a little bit about the articles for this week, give you a little bit of background, a little bit of information. Hopefully, it's helpful. So last week, I was looking at, the Ed Sullivan Show, the Beatles, the arrival of the Beatles, the sort of idea about Strawberry Fields as a place of pilgrimage, and kind of the idea about those articles want to kind of you to kind of get exposed to or read about is one, just this important historic moment of the British invasion and music in America, youth culture, sort of this thing that's really growing at that particular point in time, and then how we remember. So that Strawberry Fields Forever, sort of this idea of that it's such an important part of culture, a powerful part of culture sometimes that we start to develop a lot of history about it, a lot of recollections, a lot of personal attachment. So people make this pilgrimage to this place in Central Park. So the power of music, both as kind of a reflection of the times, things that are going on, what it's doing to transform community and culture, and then how we kind of think on things or think back on things. The articles this week are about jazz and hip hop. Just sort of give you a little bit of background about all this kind of stuff that's going on here that you'll be reading. I think it's such a fascinating thing, to sort of examine music. Oftentimes you're examining, looking at music, Western music, particularly in the United States, thinking about how forms of music get complicated by race, by class, by gender, that we can kind of look at different music forms and look at underlying issues of racism in society, sexism, classism that may be going on that's kind of fueling kind of reactions to it, and also kind of maybe it's even one of the reasons for this form of music itself. Thinking more contemporary, 1970s, 1980s, the punk, the punk movement in the 1970s came out of England, migrated to the United States. A lot of class stuff going on there, social class, working class stuff that's happening. That's the background of the formation of punk music. So I think the origins of music become really important. They give us insight to kind of historical moments, kind of what's going on in a particular time and place. And they also kind of help us to understand, what's the audience response? What's the community's response about this form of music? Is it accepted? Is it not accepted? If it's not, what are the things that people are saying about this music? So anyway, that's what you'll get with that first article, The White Reception of Jazz in America. Kind of goes back to the early days of jazz. It's kind of hard to think about now, or it's hard to imagine. It seems like, jazz, well, that's, like classical, amazing music that's by trained musicians, that we hold that up to this sort of high culture regard. When jazz was first coming out, it was not viewed through the same lens by a lot of people. That magazine, in the 1930s, I think it was 1930s, Who Put the Sin in Syncopation, the Ladies' Home Journal article, that there was a lot of race stuff that was going on in terms of people's reception of jazz in America, those early days, 20s and 30s. Part of it had to do with kind of like, if you just think about kind of what was going on in the 20s and 30s, the roaring 20s, 30s, really the development of a consumer culture starting to come, more and more urbanization, industries transforming, gender relations are being challenged in a way, issues about racial equality, race and movements starting to get more and more focus on issues of racial justice and injustice that's going on. So there's a lot of tensions that are happening, and through this music form of jazz, some of Americans' fears about racial integration and racial equity and progress and movement start to get played out in these forms, their reaction to these forms of music. So that's one article, the White Reception of Jazz. The racial rhetoric article on Bender, fascinating article examination. I lived through this time period of 1980s, 1990s, and that, the heavy metal music, there was a concern that heavy metal music was satanic worship music, that kids and youth were being brought into to the satanic worship through heavy metal music. There was a serial killer in LA. I was living in LA at the time. His name was Richard Ramirez. He was going around the community. I can't remember how many people he killed. When he was caught in his apartment, then they kind of found out where he lived, and they went through his apartment or his wherever he lived. they found AC/DC records and other metal records, and sort of this sort of connection that that heavy metal music was maybe not caused him to do this, but as a contributing factor to his homicidal behavior. So it's just fascinating what Binder does. It does this examination of that heavy metal music versus hip hop. Both of them are going on at the same time period. One of them with heavy metal, it's a white community predominantly. With hip hop, it's an urban community. It's a black community. It's a Latino community that's predominant listeners, Latina community, listeners of this music. So we are interpreting these things through a racial lens. Now hip hop is accepted, right? It's part of culture, and it's an embedded part of culture. There's no kind of negative reaction to most forms of hip hop. I think it's mainstream enough. And we've moved away from gangster rap a little bit. I mean, it's still part there. That's part of that history. And before I forget, part of that, the film you'll watch this week, Beyond Beats and Rhymes, what he gets into and talks about in that film is, this idea about, the gangster rap and sort of the bling bling and the misogyny, the sort of anti-women stuff that comes out in these hip hop videos and films. It's not about sort of inner city black culture as it is. This is a fantasy of the white middle class, their projection of stuff. I mean, the number one consumer of hip hop and rap is the white middle class. So these are fantasies that are being carried out, and stereotypes and all kinds of demeaning kind of representations that are powerful. So that's kind of a critique of those kind of things that are going on. So to go back to this racial rhetoric, sorry for jumping around. Just wanted to kind of talk about that film real quick. Her analysis, she does this great job of just trying to like, okay, what's the response? Why do we sort of respond to these different forms in different ways? So it's kind of you take that white reception of jazz, those early years, and then, okay, now we move forward to the 1980s, 1990s and get this sort of racial rhetoric piece going on there. It's sort of a continuation of history. And then the last article, the Black Arts Movement in Hip Hop, wanted you to read that to get some more background and information about the Black Arts Movement, a powerful movement of using arts to shape discussion, dialogue, content, consciousness raising, and a very deliberate, intentional project to do a lot of work, very powerful, of using art, using music, using different forms of art to present a message, to try to challenge and change and shape in a positive way. So, hip hop has that tradition. Sometimes, for those that are part that know that hip hop culture can make that separation between the gangster rap that became popular for a period of time to really about the community-driven hip hop, the message, message in a bottle. What Chuck D from Public Enemy used to say is that, it's like this stuff is like message. It's more than just beats and rhymes. It's actually news. It's information, and it's a way of developing community. That was kind of one of the projects or one of the ideas of hip hop in the early hip hop. There's a great film, before I forget too, another film called Favela Rising. So favelas are these dwellings in Sao Paulo and different areas of Brazil, major cities, right? It's where we think of like tent city, right? So people are incredibly poor. They live in shanty towns and they're sort of built up in the hills. They're called favelas. And there's favela uprising or rising. And it's about sort of the power of music to bring together Afro-Caribbean music and Afro-reggae music to bring the community together. So music can be a powerful form of shaping community, of forming community. And I think that, early hip-hop was a lot about that as a response to things that were going on at the time and as a way of bringing community together. Well, then it became really commodified. It became this sort of idea of we can package it, we can sell it to the middle class. Those are the consumers. It's the white middle class. So now we get this sort of really interesting and complicating sort of thing going on there is that what's being promoted, what's being sold may have less to do with hip-hop than it has to do with sort of white middle class ideals and perspectives and their own fantasies and wishes. And that's kind of the idea of that article. So I hope you enjoy those articles and also the film for this week. It's a phenomenal film, I think. Great job sort of examining different aspects of hip-hop and music, and hopefully you enjoy that. Thanks for all you do. We have 2 more weeks after this week looking at race and gender representations in week 9. And then week 10 is kind of like a light week. It's pretty short, kind of short read of McDonaldization of society. We're just kind of ending near the term, just kind of winding things down a little bit. So we're almost there. You're doing a phenomenal job. Thanks for all you do, and have yourself a great week.